The Western Front had settled into a kind of exhausted silence, the sort that didn't feel like peace, but like the world holding its breath. The early morning light moved slowly across the soaked trenches, touching the edges of broken sandbags and rusted wire with a pale, washed-out glow. Nothing here was sharp anymore. Not the colors, not the sounds, not even the fear. Everything felt softened by months of waiting, as if time itself had begun to move through mud. A thin fog curled above the ground, drifting between the wooden planks like a cautious visitor. German soldiers, wrapped in coats that had lost their warmth long ago, moved quietly around the dugouts. Their boots sunk gently into the wet earth, each step forming a small sigh beneath them.
Like a bruised landscape. Others warmed their hands near small stoves, letting the faint heat ease the stiffness in their fingers. There were no great battles here today, only the steady rhythm of distant artillery murmuring somewhere beyond the horizon. The sound blended with the soft flutter of a field map in the cold breeze, and with the slow, deliberate breathing of tired men who had seen too much and understood too little. Yet in this quiet, something strangely human lingered, a sense that beneath the layers of mud, smoke, and orders, they were still men, capable of noticing small things, the color of the sky, the way frost formed delicate patterns on wire, or how silence could feel almost gentle when it lasted long enough.
They were soldiers, yes, but in moments like these, they looked more like worn-out farm boys and factory workers than the iron figures painted in enemy posters. Their faces carried the pale heaviness of too little sleep and too many memories, softened further by the cold that settled into their bones each night. Some clutched tin cups of lukewarm broth, savoring it as if it were a comfort from home. Others kept their hands buried in their pockets, rubbing a coin, a button, or a small keepsake sent by someone who still believed they would return. They spoke quietly, their voices low and unhurried, as though loud words might crack the fragile calm of the morning. In these brief pauses between orders, they were simply young men trying to endure another day, holding on to what little gentleness they could find. And in that gentleness, the idea of the enemy began to feel strangely thin. Beyond the trenches, the land softened into a patchwork of fields and narrow dirt paths, the kind that once carried farmers, schoolchildren, and wandering cattle instead of patrols. A few stone cottages still stood, their roofs sagging under months of shell shock, their windows dark, but somehow dignified. Smoke sometimes rose from a distant chimney, a sign that a family had stayed behind or returned too soon, trying to stitch fragments of life back together. Scattered orchards clung stubbornly to the edges of abandoned farms, their branches bare, their fruit long fallen to hungry hands. Children moved through this landscape with a resilience adults could no longer muster. They fetched water, chased each other across quiet lanes, or carried baskets of bread for families who had lost everything. Their presence felt both fragile and ordinary, a reminder that life, no matter how bruised, still pressed gently against the edges of war. Not far from the trenches, where the land dipped into gentle fields and winding lanes, French children continued their small routines with a kind of bravery they didn't yet recognize as bravery. Their mornings began with the creak of old doors and the soft rustle of aprons, as mothers sent them out to gather water or fetch bread from what remained of the village bakery. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and wood smoke, and their footsteps echoed lightly against the stones, as though the earth itself wished to shield them from the distant rumble of artillery. They walked in pairs or small groups,
carrying baskets too large for their hands, speaking in hushed voices that drifted like birdsong through the quiet streets.
For the children living near the front, the war had become an unsettling kind of normal. They had grown used to the distant echo of guns and the slow drift of smoke on the horizon, the way adults paused mid-sentence to listen for something they hoped not to hear. Curiosity pulled them toward the edges of the fields, where the world changed abruptly from familiar farmland to the strange geometry of trenches and wire. They wondered who lived beyond that boundary, whether the men in gray coats were as fearsome as whispered stories claimed, or simply tired faces like the ones they saw at home. Boredom also played its part. With schools closed, chores limited, and the village hollowed of its usual noise, the front became an unspoken mystery. Dangerous, yes, but irresistibly present. Sometimes an older sibling dared to go near the wire for firewood or wild herbs, and younger ones followed at a cautious distance, learning the route by heart. They crept as close as they dared, studying the silent shapes on the other side, trying to understand the war by looking directly at it. In time, approaching the front became a quiet ritual, a mixture of fear and innocent wonder that neither adults nor soldiers could fully explain.
The first interaction happened almost by accident, carried on the kind of timid courage only children possess. A small group had wandered closer than usual, stopping where the tall grass thinned and the barbed wire rose in a crooked line before them. On the other side, a German sentry noticed the movement, but did not raise his rifle. He simply watched, unsure if the moment required fear or stillness. One child, no more than 8, took a hesitant step forward, clutching a crust of bread he had been nibbling on. He didn't offer it, not yet. He only looked at the soldier with wide, curious eyes.
It happened on a morning washed in pale sunlight, the kind that made the dew shimmer on broken fence posts and turned the air cool enough to feel like a fresh beginning. The children appeared at the edge of the field in a small cluster, whispering to each other as if sharing a delicate secret. In their hands they carried flowers, simple wild blossoms gathered from the meadows that had somehow survived the passing of armies. Some were clutched tightly, stems bruised by small fingers. Others were held carefully, as though the children feared the petals might fall before they reached the wire. The German soldiers noticed them early, their eyes drawn by the flashes of color moving across the muted landscape. Blues, yellows, soft whites, all drifting toward the trenches like tiny defiant signals that refused to bow to the gray world around them. A few men straightened, setting aside their tools and stepping closer, unsure if they had mistaken the sight. Flowers were rare here, beauty even rarer.
Something softened, almost visibly. A soldier stooped, reaching through the wire as far as he dared without touching the sharpened metal. His fingers brushed the stems, careful as though handling something sacred. The children smiled, relieved. In that quiet moment, surrounded by mud, smoke, and ruin, the flowers seemed brighter than the sun itself. For a long moment, the soldiers stood frozen, unsure how to respond to something so gentle arriving in a place shaped entirely by fear. A few exchanged puzzled glances, their brows furrowed as if trying to decide whether this was allowed or even real. They had grown used to shouts, orders, and the heavy clang of metal, not to children offering color and kindness. One man rubbed his eyes with the back of his sleeve, almost embarrassed by his own disbelief. Another, older and usually stern, let his shoulders sink as if releasing a weight he didn't realize he was carrying. Slowly, the confusion gave way to a softer, almost hesitant tenderness. A young soldier.
A quiet murmur drifted through them, something gentle, almost grateful. The flowers reminded them of home, of fields untouched by war, and of the humanity they feared they had lost. In a place where the earth had forgotten softness, the flowers carried a meaning far larger than their fragile stems suggested. They were a quiet defiance against the logic of war, a reminder that beauty could still bloom even in soil torn open by shells. For the soldiers, the blossoms stirred memories of distant summers, fields swaying under warm skies, gardens tended by mothers and sisters, simple days untouched by the weight of uniforms. Each petal felt like a small rescue, lifting them for a moment above the barbed wire and mud. For the children, the flowers were the only language they had that could cross the divide without fear. They offered what little they possessed: color, fragrance, softness, hoping it might reach the men they had been taught to fear. And in that exchange, something wordless passed between them, widening the moment into something gently unforgettable. Long after the children disappeared back into the fields, the soldiers found themselves reaching for their notebooks, small weathered diaries kept hidden in coat pockets or tucked beneath blankets. These pages, stained by damp air and smudged by tired hands, became the only safe place where they could speak honestly. That evening, as a thin wash of moonlight settled over the trenches, several men wrote quietly, trying to capture the strangeness of what they had witnessed. One young soldier described the moment as a softness I had forgotten existed, noting how the flowers felt unreal against the harshness around him. Another wrote of a little girl with a ribbon in her hair, wondering if she reminded him of a cousin he hadn't seen in years. A third admitted he felt his throat tighten.
In the village behind the fields, French families reported their own quiet impressions of that day, though their words lived not in military diaries, but in letters, shared stories, and small pages tucked inside kitchen drawers. Mothers wrote to husbands stationed far from home, describing how the children had returned with dirt on their shoes and an unusual brightness in their eyes. One woman mentioned her daughter's excitement, how she had held out her empty hands as if they still carried the flowers she'd given away. Another mother confessed she felt both fear and pride. Fear because the front was no place for children. Pride because their innocence had accomplished what adults no longer knew how to attempt. A local shopkeeper, whose building stood at the edge of the village, later told neighbors he had watched the children cross the meadow with a sense of disbelief. He said the morning light made them look like they were walking out of a story rather than into the shadow of war. An elderly farmer, writing to his son, described seeing small figures moving toward the wire, their steps hesitant but strangely steady, as though guided by something kinder than reason. Some accounts held worry. What if the soldiers reacted poorly? What if the children misunderstood danger as curiosity? But mingled with the fear was a tender recognition. In offering flowers, the children had carried a piece of the village's heart to men who rarely saw anything soft. Their simple gesture rippled quietly through the community, becoming a story people returned to when they needed to remember that humanity still breathed beneath the smoke. What struck historians later was not the scale of these moments, but their quietness. They were rarely spoken of in official reports, never praised in newspapers, and almost never mentioned by generals. Instead, they lived in the margins, in the small handwriting of soldiers, in the folded letters of French families, in the half-remembered stories passed down over kitchen tables long after the war ended. These gestures survived not because they were grand, but because many of the diaries that describe the flowers were left unfinished, their pages stopping abruptly when regiments were moved or battles swept men away. Some letters from the village were never delivered, found years later in trunks or attics, their ink faded, but their warmth unmistakable. Yet despite their fragility, these accounts carried a kind of emotional weight the larger histories often missed, a reminder that even in a world defined by strategy and suffering, moments of grace found their way through. In reading them now, one senses a gentle ache, as if touching the edge of something precious and fleeting. These small acts, barely noticed by the war itself, became the quiet proof that humanity had not vanished, only retreated into the hands of children and the hearts of tired men. In the days that followed, the memory of the flowers lingered like a faint scent carried on the wind, but the machinery of the war continued its relentless work. Far beyond the gentle fields where children wandered, factories roared day and night, forging shells, rifles, and endless lengths of barbed wire. Trains groaned across Europe, packed with supplies and young men who had not yet learned the weight of silence. Maps were spread across tables in distant headquarters, pins and lines deciding the fate of thousands with a coldness that felt almost unreal, compared to the fragile blossoms pressed between small hands. The trenches, too, reminded everyone of the immense scale of the conflict. Miles of dugouts stretched across the land like scars, filled with the constant hum of preparation. Sharpening bayonets, restacking sandbags, checking rifles that had long since lost their shine. Even on quiet days, the air trembled with the low, steady pulse of artillery far away. Each distant boom a reminder that kindness existed only in the thin spaces the war forgot to claim. Against this vast machinery, the children's gestures seemed impossibly small, almost fragile enough to be dismissed. Yet the soldiers felt the contrast deeply. They knew the war was too large to be softened by a handful of wildflowers, and yet the memory of that offering stood firm, refusing to be drowned by strategy or steel. In a world built on overwhelming force, that single act became a gentle measure of what still mattered, even when everything else felt beyond reach. Most soldiers understood the unspoken rule. Gentleness was not encouraged, because it made the weight of their duty harder to carry. Those who had accepted the blossoms tucked them away discreetly, hiding them between pages of notebooks or beneath their blankets, aware that the simple beauty of a flower could be interpreted as a lapse in vigilance. Still, no harsh punishment followed. The moment was too small to provoke outrage and too human to erase completely. What lingered was a quiet sadness, the understanding that even warmth had to remain hidden, like the fragile light carried beneath the heavy cloak of war. The kindness shared at the wire did not go unnoticed by those who held authority, though it received no praise and little tolerance. Interactions with civilians, especially children, were discouraged, sometimes quietly, sometimes with sharp reminders posted on wooden boards or delivered through clipped orders at roll call. Command feared such moments would blur the lines between soldier and enemy, weakening the discipline required to keep men anchored in a war that demanded constant hardness. A few officers, hearing rumors of flowers exchanged through the wire, shook their heads and dismissed it as foolish sentiment, something that had no place in the machinery they managed. What lingered was a quiet sadness, the understanding that even warmth had to remain hidden, like a fragile light carried beneath the heavy cloak of war. As the weeks stretched on and the front shifted into harsher seasons, the soldiers found themselves returning to the memory of the flowers more often than they expected. In the long nights when the cold crept under their coats and the sky rumbled with distant bombardment, they would touch the pressed petals hidden in their diaries or remember the small hands that had offered them. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope felt too large for the trenches, but it was something quieter, a reminder that the world beyond the wire still held softness waiting to be found. Some carried the memory into battles that darkened the horizon with smoke. When orders came and the lines surged forward or retreated in chaos, they found that the thought of those children steadied them in a strange way. It reminded them that they were still human beneath the uniform, that they were more than fear, exhaustion, and duty. Even in moments when the earth shook and voices rose in panic, a few held tight to the small image of color moving across a gray field.
The flowers became their own kind of anchor, a gentle truth carried silently through mud and fire, a reminder that kindness, once received, does not disappear. Historians often find themselves drawn not only to the grand strategies and sweeping offensives of war, but also to the small, almost invisible gestures that flicker briefly between them. Over the years, those who studied the Western Front began to notice how these quiet moments, flowers at a wire, a shared cigarette, a whispered greeting across trenches, carried a meaning far out of proportion to their size. They called them micro-acts of humanity, tiny fractures in the machinery of conflict where something softer managed to shine through. In archives and private collections, historians traced the faded handwriting of soldiers who had carefully recorded these fragile experiences, sometimes with more emotion than they used for describing entire battles. When interviewed, historians often spoke of these moments with a tone that blended curiosity and respect. They recognized that such gestures rarely altered the course of the war, yet they revealed something deeper about the people living inside it. These acts were windows, brief openings into the emotional landscapes of men and children, navigating a world bent on erasing tenderness. The significance lay not in their impact on strategy, but in the way they preserved a thread of humanity where none should logically exist. As scholars pieced together diaries and civilian letters, they noticed how consistently these stories resurfaced, as though they carried an echo that refused to fade. Through their eyes, the flowers offered by children became more than an anecdote. They became a symbol of what endured, quietly, beneath the thunder of history. The flowers given through the wire were not the only moment in the Great War when compassion rose unexpectedly from the mud. Historians often placed this small exchange alongside other fragile episodes, rare, fleeting, yet powerful in their quiet defiance. They spoke of the Christmas truce of 1914, when men who had been firing at one another only days before stepped onto the frozen ground to shake hands, share tobacco, and play football until nightfall reclaimed the field. They mentioned frontline medics who risked their lives to tend to wounded enemies, dragging strangers to safety because suffering recognized no uniform. Letters from both sides described brief lulls in fighting, when soldiers called out warnings before artillery barrages, offering their foes a chance to take cover.
These moments were scattered, like sparks briefly visible in a long, dark corridor. Each one differed in scale and circumstance, yet they carried the same quiet signature. Ordinary people responding to extraordinary hardship by choosing kindness over cruelty, if only for a heartbeat. When viewed together, they formed a soft constellation across the vast sky of the war, suggesting that even in the most violent chapters of human history, compassion surfaced again and again, stubborn and luminous, refusing to disappear. In modern times, these small stories from the trenches have taken on a quiet but persistent influence. They remind people that the concept of an enemy is often shaped by distance, fear, and circumstance rather than by the true nature of those on the other side. When students read about children offering flowers or soldiers sharing brief moments of kindness, they pause, not because the events are grand, but because they reveal how natural empathy can be, even in places designed to crush it. Such accounts soften the edges of history, allowing readers to imagine themselves in those fleeting exchanges, feeling the same mix of curiosity and recognition. These stories ripple outward into conversations about conflict today, encouraging a gentler lens and a slower judgment. They suggest that even in times of division, simple human gestures still have the power to cross boundaries that politics cannot. When we return to that quiet morning at the barbed wire, the scene feels softer now, held gently by everything we've learned along the way. The children approaching with their handful of wildflowers, the soldiers watching in stillness, the small, trembling hands offering color to a world drained of it. These moments settle into the story like a final, steady breath. What happened there was simple, almost impossibly so, yet it lingers because it touched something that survived beneath all the noise of the war. The blossoms, pressed through the gaps in twisted metal, became a reminder that even war tried and failed to erase innocence, curiosity, and the small courage it takes to offer kindness first. In the end, it is these small gestures that stay with us, the ones that seem too delicate to matter, yet outlast the noise of their time. A few flowers passed through barbed wire did nothing to change the course of the war, but they changed the people who witnessed them. They proved that kindness can survive even where it has no reason to. And when we carry such stories forward, they remind us that every era, including our own, is shaped not only by grand decisions, but by